So this book includes about 600 never before seen images of the Emirate of Sharjah or city of Sharjah. The reason I want to talk about this today is that in many cases, especially folks like you who work in international archives and libraries around the world, you might think that one easy way of getting images and archives is to, I feel like this book is covering most of, okay, here, is going through the National Archive or the National Library and obtaining pictures. But that's not how things work in the Gulf. In the Gulf, we have to think about new ways of obtaining images, new ways of obtaining literature, new ways of obtaining information. And even though in the process of researching this book, we went as far as Minnesota and Tokyo and all the way to Karachi and Baghdad and every city you can imagine in the Middle East, we really had to rely on one factor here, which is regular people who came to the Gulf in the 1950s and 60s and 70s from India, from Pakistan, from Egypt, from Palestine and elsewhere. These individuals really were an archive of the city's history and the city's development. Out to their children, their grandchildren, and ask them to open up their archives and ask them to look over things that they thought and believed were mundane, things that they didn't think are important. It's just my father's picture next to a building, or it's just my grandmother's photo next to this space or this door or this classroom. But these actually were sources of information and imagery that unlocked treasure troves, we believe, in the Gulf and in Sharjah specifically. So the book is divided into two sections. One section is here on the left, and it is about a dozen essays. These essays, we took advantage of an opportunity to deep dive into different aspects of the city. So we have essays that I'll talk about coming up, but we have an essay, for example, that you wouldn't think you would find in a book on urbanism. But it was about the impact that Kuwait City or Kuwait Emirate had on the development of the Trucial Coast of the UAE. So the Emirates, before the unification, were known as the Trucial Coast. So Kuwait Emirate was very, very generous with the Trucial Coast, having funded education opportunities, having sent teachers, having sent books, having sent clothes for the students to study. And my mother, who was a teacher, was a recipient of this information, of this this largesse, this generosity of Kuwait. My own mother was a recipient of this generosity. So Kuwait would send students two sets of clothes, one for the winter, one for the summer. And His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, in numerous times, had thanked Kuwait publicly and in many different places for all the efforts that Kuwait put in the development of the healthcare and the education institutions in Dubai and the other Emirates, of course. So other things we looked at in this book was a history of the first photographer who came from India, who worked in Sharjah, and the first Palestinian family, or one of the first Palestinian families. What was very interesting about the first Palestinian families is that when Sharjah was developing, there was an area where I was born, in the 70s, called Fayha. And that area was the first area where Palestinians were able to own in Sharjah. And one thing we discovered is that because the Palestinians had left their homes or had moved from their homeland to the Gulf, what they did, which architecturally, so this is how architecture tells you stories of human beings, right? So what they did is that they rebuilt their homes in Sharjah based on their homes that they left in Palestine, which was very interesting. So the architect was told, no, when I want you to design my home to look like my home in Palestine, when you enter, there's a living room. On the left is the kitchen. On the right is the dining hall. And then there is the bedrooms in the back. And so it's just a story of how people supplanted and brought their memories back with them when they traveled to new places. Other things we did was, when I'll talk about them, is a history of the first public performance in Sharjah, which was done in a building called the Central Souk in Sharjah. So in the 1980s, a group of artists from Dubai and Sharjah went and did a public performance. So this is how architecture and art and history converge. On the right, so the left are the deep dive, the essays. On the right are 60 buildings where we had one page, so one pagers only. So we had, what's interesting is we had histories of buildings that were completely forgotten. For example, there was a building called Kuwait Tower. Kuwait Tower was owned by a Kuwaiti businessman who built it in the 70s. When Kuwait was occupied in 1990, that building became a refuge for many Kuwaitis in Sharjah. What else can I tell you? We have the story of the school, a school known as Shuaifat. Shuaifat is a very famous school. Shuaifat had moved to Sharjah in 1975 when the civil war broke up in Lebanon. Teachers put their blackboards and their desks and the chairs, put them in trucks and drove to Syria, then Jordan, then Saudi Arabia to Sharjah, and took over the barracks. The British had just left in 1972. So Shuaifat school, founded in Sharjah, 2-3 years later, in the barracks that the British had left. So this tells you the story of how the first school started, how the first newspaper started, and whatnot. Okay, so I'm going to go now to some of the first buildings I wanted to document. I'll only talk about 3 buildings because we have limited time. But the first building I'd like to mention is the first professionally designed cinema in Sharjah, known as Sharjah Cinema, which was designed by a Dutch architect in the 1960s. He had worked in Kenya and Bahrain, and then he was told that some businessman in Sharjah from Al Mullah family wanted to establish a cinema. So he came from Bahrain and he settled in Sharjah. And by the way, he designed many buildings in Dubai. He designed one of the hotels in Dubai known as Saint George Hotel on the creek. He designed Galadari's in Dubai, Galadari's Mazda headquarters in the 1970s. And he designed Sharjah Cinema in the 1960s. So he stayed in the UAE for a while, but he was never trained as an architect. But what I want to talk about is this image. So this image that, again, we had to look into unconventional places to find it. So we didn't go to the National Archive and say, give me an image of Sharjah Cinema. We had to become our own archive. I had to go online and post and say, does anyone have a picture of Sharjah Cinema? Does anyone have an image of this building? And of course, thanks to the work of Ammar Al-Attar, who is an artist as well as a researcher, we were able to find images. But what I want to show you here is, this is the image of the opening of Sharjah Cinema that took place in 1969. And you will find a bunch of Arabs standing to enter a building designed by a Dutch person to watch an Indian movie from Bollywood called Babul Ki Galiyan, very famous movie in the 1960s. And look at the signboard. It says Peking Restaurant. So you have Arabs standing in line to watch an Indian movie in a Dutch building with a Chinese cinema. And they tell you globalization came to the UAE in the last 10, 20 years, where the UAE really was globalized many, many decades before. And I love that the restaurant Peking, you can't really see it very clearly here, but Peking Restaurant, the name was written in Arabic, English, and Chinese. And so I always wondered, who wrote this? Who was the Chinese consultant in the 1960s in the Emirates? And so what I want to tell you is, through this one image, you can see an example of diversity of the UAE community. You see how you hear today a lot about the UAE being a tolerant society, and tolerance being very important and part of the DNA of the UAE. This shows you that tolerance really is embedded, or respect and acceptance is really embedded in the country even before the establishment of the state. Now, finding the names of architects is a lot of fun, but sometimes it just doesn't happen. Like the case of this building, known as the Flying Saucer. Now, the Flying Saucer in Sharjah, it wasn't just a one-off building in the Middle East. In fact, it was part of a string of buildings that were built in the 60s and 70s, because the whole world was intrigued and interested in the skies, in the universe. Of course, you know John F. Kennedy's promise that they'll put a man on the moon by the end of the 60s, right? And many other promises. The Russians or the Soviets had sent Sputnik, and the Americans were racing to the moon. And so the whole world was thinking about outer space. And so here you see a manifestation of outer space in the Emirates, all the way back in the 1970s. And I can give you examples of other buildings that were built in the same era. If you think of Seattle, there's the Space Needle that was inaugurated in 1962. 62. If you think, for example, of the Slovak radio building in Czechoslovakia, that was inaugurated in 72. Same time this thing was built. And so you see examples of buildings all the way in America and Europe and the Middle East, all thinking about outer space. But this building was a challenge. It was a very difficult building to find any information about. The company that built it had shut down. The architect had died. We didn't have any information. And so what we did was, I think, something quite creative or innovative. We reached out to one of the most famous storytellers in the UAE. He's a professor at NYU Abu Dhabi, and his name is Deepak Unnikrishnan. So Deepak Unnikrishnan wrote a number of fictional books. He actually teaches literature, I believe, at NYU Abu Dhabi. And we told him, Deepak, you're a great writer of fiction. Could you write a story about this building, since we don't have the name of the architect? And to be honest, the building is just too beautiful just to stick on a page and say unknown building, unknown architect, there it is. So we wanted someone to come in and imagine a story. So Deepak wrote a 3,000-word fictional story of this building, where he imagined a protagonist driving around Sharjah, entering the building and attending a cricket match. And so it's a huge building. So the building isn't that big. I mean, it's big, but it's not huge, right? You can't really play a cricket game in this building if you know anything about cricket, okay? Maybe a mini cricket game. But what he did was that he imagined the building as a huge stadium size, and how a group of people were playing cricket in it, and what happened in the story. And I think it's one of the most fascinating chapters in this book. So yes, this book is the story of documenting the architecture of Sharjah, but it's not your regular book where you have picture of a building, name of architect, the year completion, next. So this is really a creative way of talking about the city of Sharjah. Believe it or not, a few months after the book was published, I found the name of the architect. And so it's not in this book, but I can tell you it was an Italian architect. I'm saving the name, so when I publish it one day in a paper. Next, I want to tell you about this really odd-looking structure. So not every major building is a building of note, is a huge building, is a giant structure that is beautiful as the MBR library. Not every building that is important has to be huge. Sometimes small buildings can tell you a lot of history. Sometimes buildings that are underrated are buildings that held a lot of importance in the history of a city. I worked on the commission to safeguard buildings in the UAE, and one of our criteria wasn't only, is it a beautiful building, we want to save it. No, did anything important happen here? Or did this building represent a period of time that needs to be documented? So what I want to tell you about is this structure that was designed by an Indian architect in the 1970s. And this is known as the 1,000 Villas project. And the 1,000 Villas is really a metaphor, for me, is a metaphor for the UAE. Why? Because the UAE was developing so fast, believe it or not, faster than now. Because we went from a few 100,000 to 2 million or 3 million in 20 years. So we were doubling over and over. And so the UAE was absorbing a lot of immigrants, and we needed to accommodate these immigrants. And you can't build, skyscrapers. You can't build traditional structures. So what this architect did was that he came up with an inventive design featuring two half-cylindrical roof shapes that can be constructed very, very fast to accommodate who? Accommodate teachers, accommodate healthcare workers, education workers, engineers, medical workers, because these were white-collar workers who wanted a home, they wanted a house, and they wanted to move to the UAE very fast. And so these structures popped up to accommodate all these individuals who are engineers, who are teachers, who are the medical workers. Next, I want to tell you about this publication, which is one of the most important publications in the history of the UAE. Again, this book for me wasn't just a story of a building. Yes, it's about architecture, but it's also about life. It's also about how the human being was developed. How a human being was developed. And so we wanted to write about the story of this magazine. That was founded in 1979 by three friends. Actually, two of them were brothers from the Ghubash family, and Abdullah Ali al-Sharhan, as well as the brothers Muhammad and Ghanem Ghubash. These individuals come from some of the most respected families in the UAE, and they established a magazine that brought together writers, thinkers, artists, poets, and community leaders of the UAE. In fact, this publication which is now, by the way, in the National Archive or the National Library in the UAE in Abu Dhabi, you have spaces of these publications. But this publication was a metaphor for the development of a city. So when a city is developed, it's not only, when you think of Dubai in 1979, you're not only thinking of Burj, the World Trade Center that we call, Emiratis call Burj Rashid, but it's called the World Trade Center. So you don't only think of the World Trade Center, you think of the schools, you think of the publications, you think of all the cultural and intellectual life that was developed. And so we wanted to archive this magazine and archive its importance in this book. Al-Azmina al-Arabiya roughly translates into, the times of Arabia today. Next, I want to show you this beautiful image that I found through WhatsApp, through friends. So there was, in this single image, you see 3 decades of development in Sharjah. It's really one of my favorite images in the book that we gave it a full spread. This image is of a school that was built by Kuwait. So in 1951, the ruler of Kuwait, Abdullah Salim, came to visit Sharjah in the Emirates and decided to grant them assistance when it comes to education and healthcare. And the Kuwaitis established a Kuwait office here in Dubai about 11 years later. It was on the creek, one of the most beautiful buildings. So inshallah, one day when someone works on the Architecture of Dubai book, I hope they have that building because it's a beautiful building. And Kuwait was very generous. Again, as I said, giving people stipends, paying salaries. Do you know that the teachers' salaries in the Emirates were higher than teachers' salaries in Kuwait? And the reason they did that was because of hardship, was because the UAE was underdeveloped. So they had to give people extra so that they decide to move to the UAE and stay in the UAE. Teachers came again from Egypt, from Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and elsewhere. So in this picture, you see kids playing in one of the Kuwait designed schools, again, built and staffed by Kuwait. And in the background, so this was from the 50s. In the foreground, you see the building. Wait, do I have a clicker here? I think there's a clicker, but I don't know how to use it. So the foreground, you see the Kuwait school. The building right behind it, immediately behind it, which is a silver-colored building, was designed by Khatib and Alami, who were Lebanese-based Palestinian architects who were active in the UAE in the 60s and 70s, and it became the office of the Arab Bank. Arab Bank is one of the oldest banks in the Arab world. And then all the way in the back, and the first HSBC in the region on the right. Do you see? That building on the right is the first HSBC on the region. Now, at the very end in the back is a Spanish designed set of buildings. Do you see the 4 buildings that look alike? This is a Spanish design building or set of road, which was the first Wall Street in the UAE, the first financial center which was built in the UAE in Sharjah in the mid-70s. And so you can see Sharjah from the 50s, 60s, and 70s all in one image with these kids running around the playground. The next image I want to show you is one of my favorite images as well, which is the Sharjah Cricket Stadium. So why am I showing you Sharjah Cricket Stadium? It's because Sharjah Cricket Stadium, which is also documented here, was one of the most important sites for sports diplomacy. Have you heard of this word before? Sports diplomacy. What is sports what does sport have to do with diplomacy? They're different worlds, but in reality, they are very much intertwined. There's a connection. So what happened was that this structure that was built in the 1970s became a very important site for Pakistan and India to play cricket. So Pakistan and India had gone through 3 wars. There was a war in 1965, and then in 1971, I think in 71 there were 2 wars, I think. So there were 2 skirmishes or conflicts. So for about a decade and a half, Pakistan and India, who were the 2 greatest cricket nations in the world, no offense to the Australians and the others, that these are the 2 greatest cricket nations, couldn't play. And so how could you have the 2 greatest cricket playing teams not play together? So in steps the UAE and Sharjah. And Sharjah Cricket Stadium, which was designed by a British architect, became the site of sports diplomacy. And for the first time in 1982, the Pakistani and the Indian teams played, and it is probably the most famous cricket game in the past 50 years. If you think of this is like the pinnacle of sports diplomacy for me. So think about the history of the school, of the history of the stadium, and it was built by a Sharjah-based businessman who grew up between Pakistan and India. So Abdurrahman Bukhatar, who's now in his mid-80s. So he lived in India and Pakistan, and so he understood the 2 people. And when he came back here, he wanted to offer them this space. The last thing I want to talk about, so some of the buildings I showed you are gone. Most of them are gone. But what I want to say is, even though this is not in our structure, I want to say that Sharjah and the UAE especially, over the past few years, has become much more aware of the importance of archiving architecture, the importance of saving buildings. Now, if you think in Dubai, there are at least a dozen buildings, maybe more, that are protected legally, including the clock tower in Deira, including the World Trade Center in Sheikh Zayed Road, and many other buildings. And in Abu Dhabi, the National Theatre, designed by Iraqi architect Makkiya, also protected, and many other buildings. And the same thing in Sharjah. Many buildings are protected in Sharjah. So the UAE has gone from being one of the countries that, because of development, was losing so much of its modern heritage, to a country that now is setting an example to others around the region in protecting cultural heritage. The reason I'm showing you this picture, which is by Al-Masri architects, Al-Masri planners and architects, is that even architects, when they are designing new developments and new master plans, they are saving the old buildings. It's no longer the case of demolishing the old buildings. And so I'm really hoping that this book, which took me 5 years with a group of friends and colleagues, took 5 years to document one city, that this book will serve as a guide for people to understand, especially the young generation, to understand the importance of buildings, the importance of buildings as places of storytelling, as places of history, as places of history making in the UAE. I'll stop here, and I'm happy to take questions if you have any. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sultan. I mean, Sultan is an asset to UAE culture, and his great efforts in archiving, documenting not only architecture in Sharjah and art in UAE, but also even in helping archiving Arab modern art. So he's a dear friend of mine, and I always feel proud when I see any of his projects come to fruition. But the National Theatre is not by Makia, it's by Rafat Jadarji.
Yeah. Thank you.
By
Thank you.
Rafat Jadarji. And really, it is sad sometimes to see some modern buildings that have been done by, even if not that well, iconic architects, but also non-architects that have been demolished over the years. It is sad. Maybe for, very established countries, some of the 70s architecture or 60s is not considered old for them. But for us, architecture from the 60s and 70s and even 80s is very important. And sometimes people don't understand. The famous building in Abu Dhabi of the Cultural Foundation, a time came when they wanted to demolish it. And thank God it had been saved by the government. And it was built, it was designed by Gropius Group. And Gropius is such an iconic name in the history of architecture. To have such an relatively early building and very important building culturally also in our capital by that group is in itself is a matter of pride. And it also shows you that UAE, even from an early age, they were thinking of bringing to the UAE the best of international architects. Even buildings like the Sheikh Zayed Stadium in Abu Dhabi, the Officers Club in Abu Dhabi, these have been designed by great French architects, you know. And there are also other buildings in Dubai also. So I think we need more and more efforts to document those buildings, to write about them academically, to have beautiful books like the book that Sultan really brought to life. I admire Sultan's work, and I think we need 5, 6 sultans in UAE to save our culture and save our heritage.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. I don't have any words, but I'm so grateful to your kindness and generosity.
Thank you so much for this. I wanted to, maybe in your opinion, there are a lot of librarians here. How can they help in preserving this knowledge and educating the youth in understanding the history of the UAE?
So, you know, when I was working on this book, I was living in the US and I was teaching in the first year in Boston College. And I want to say, you know, a huge thanks to the librarian of Boston College. I don't remember her name, but she was very helpful because there was a manuscript and a movie, a film that was filmed in Sharjah, a movie that was filmed in Sharjah in the 70s. What happened was that there was this famous Indian film director who wanted to film in Dubai, but he didn't get a license. So he had moved his crew to the Emirates, and he was waiting for a license to film in Dubai. And for some reason, he didn't get the license. So he filmed in Sharjah as a stand-in for Dubai. And the only library in the world that had it was the University of Wisconsin, which I never thought that documenting a book on Sharjah, I would have to resort to the University of Wisconsin. And so the librarians communicated, and they were able to get us images from that movie that we featured in the book. So you could find it. It's a chapter about filmmaking in Sharjah and filming. And the role of librarians as not only guardians of, you know, documents and books and manuscripts and all these things, but also in connecting to other libraries. I think it is paramount that librarians have a strong network, that you are not working in an island. I think this conference is the biggest example of the role of Mohammed bin Rashid Library. Mohammed bin Rashid Library, yes, it's a beautiful library here in Dubai, but it's part of a network of libraries. And so you have in this library today and this weekend, you have librarians from Middle East, from Asia, from Europe and North America. And this is exactly the role of the library, is to connect researchers to other entities in case the documents that they need are elsewhere. I'll also give you an example of once there was a group of researchers here in Dubai. I was living in Boston, and they're twin Emiratis, Ahmed and Rashid bin Shabib, and they were doing their masters. I think one of them got his PhD, Mabruk. And so they were researching Dubai architecture and Dubai urbanism. And they sent me a message and said, Sultan, you're in Boston. MIT Library has the only copy of Dubai Creek Master Plan. I didn't know that, they knew that. Could you please go and photograph it for us? And so I went to MIT Library and I tried to take pictures, and I failed because it's a huge document and it's a team to photograph it. So what I did is, I'm giving you a little tip. I went on a website called TaskRabbit. So you know TaskRabbit? So you go on TaskRabbit and you hire people for jobs. So in America, you can hire someone to come and help you document. So I hired a professional photographer to come to the library, got them access to MIT Library, where this person was able to use a professional camera and document the master plan of the Dubai Creek. And I sent it to the brothers, the Shabib brothers here in Dubai. This is 7-8 years ago. And inshallah, hopefully it helped them in their research. What I want to say is that it's very important for us in the UAE, in Dubai and elsewhere, that we have copies of documents that are relevant to our history. That we don't only rely on MIT Library and Harvard or whatever, British libraries, but we have to, as much as possible, be centers of archives of our own history, especially our own history, so that when you have a researcher that comes to the UAE, when they conduct research, the best place to conduct research in the UAE should be the UAE. Unfortunately now, in many cases, people end up going to UK libraries, but things are changing very fast and improving, and I think part of the National Library, part of MBR Library, is bringing these documents and bringing these books and opportunities for researchers to be here. And I'll say one last thing. If it wasn't for MBR Library, we all wouldn't be here today. So again, this is emerging as a center of excellence, research, and knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you so much for an incredible journey. And my favorite building has always been the Flying Saucer. And great that you found out the architect to do it. I hadn't realized that was tied into the whole world going on this space journey. You spoke about someone writing a story. So is there a plan, and I hope you have a plan, Sultan, to document the storytellers whilst they're still with us, that can tell us the stories, whether they're living in Fujairah, Sharjah, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, because I feel there are so many rich stories. The plague of locusts, the outbreak of smallpox, all these things, they are there, but they're going to be lost. And we do not have those personal stories from individuals across the Emirates. Please tell me you can do it.
Thank you. I think this is an effort that relies on everybody here. It's not a single individual, and I'm very encouraged when I go to Ittihad Museum. You enter the theater, and there are individuals speaking who are telling their own stories. There are people who saw the birth and the establishment of the UAE speaking. You can just sit in that theater. It's a bit cool, so bring a sweater and listen to people talk about the history of the UAE. There are other initiatives like Lest We Forget. Lest We Forget is an initiative also by the Sheikh Salama bint Hamdan Foundation, I believe in Abu Dhabi, and they're also documenting people's histories. I know that the Sheikh Zayed National museum is also documenting people's histories. So the UAE is changing, but unfortunately, Isobel, we are losing the generation of people who witnessed, not only witnessed, but were part of the founding of the country. And so there is some kind of urgency that we need to document these lives. We need to interview them. And I think maybe let me say this from this stage is it is no longer a luxury of the older generation to document their lives. It is a necessity. So it's no longer that they choose or not choose to do it. There must be a way to encourage them. If they can't write, to interview them. If they don't want the information to be released in public, there are ways to make sure that these cassettes or these audio tapes are saved for posterity's sake, for the sake of the future younger researchers in 10 and 20 years. There must be a way to encourage individuals to write their histories. And I'm very encouraged that there are leaders who have written their history, their own history in the UAE. There are biographies. The ones I think of are His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid, who has a couple of really interesting books. I think they can be expanded many times. His Highness the Ruler of Sharjah has a set of books also that are very important. I know that these are autobiographies, by the way, not just biographies. For example, there are other books like Isa Saleh Al-Gurq in Dubai, a businessman, very important businessman. There is Muhammad Abd Jalil Al-Fahim in Abu Dhabi, and I'm sure I'm forgetting some. And there are many books coming on the way, I know, of families writing their histories. But this is something that we should encourage and definitely do it as soon as possible. Thank you very much. Thank you.
دبي موئل الثقافات وحاضنة الإبداع، تحتضن بين أركانها مزيجا فريدا من الثقافات والتقاليد، حيث يلتقي التراث العريق مع الفكر الحديث. على مر العصور كانت دبي مركزا للحوار الحضاري وبيئة مثالية لتلاقي العقول والأفكار من مختلف أرجاء العالم، ساعية دوما لتعزيز ثقافة المعرفة والانفتاح. وهنا اليوم في قلب دبي حيث يبنى المستقبل، في هذا الصرح الثقافي مكتبة محمد بن راشد تلتقي نخبة من العقول من جميع أنحاء العالم في حدث يجمع بين أمجاد الماضي وتحديات الحاضر ورؤى المستقبل. أهلا بكم في أول نسخة من مؤتمر دبي الدولي للمكتبات، حيث تبدأ رحلة جديدة لإعادة تعريف دور المكتبات في العالم. أكثر من 60 خبيرا من 25 دولة يجتمعون ليطرحوا رؤى جديدة ستعيد تشكيل مفهوم المكتبات. استعدوا لاستكشاف التحول الرقمي في المكتبات عبر الذكاء الاصطناعي واكتشاف الكنوز الأيقونية والمجموعات النادرة. من خلال أكثر من 60 جلسة نلقي الضوء على مستقبل المكتبات وأهمية التراث والمعرفة للأجيال القادمة. إنه الحدث الذي سيخلد في تاريخ المكتبات، مؤتمر دبي الدولي للمكتبات 2024، حيث يجتمع الماضي والحاضر والمستقبل.